Welcome to Windows on the World, and I think we're live. We're going to be talking tonight about Freemasonry, Kabbalah, and the Enlightenment period of the 17 to 1800s, but going back to the origins of the Rosicrucians, and actually a little before that. We're going to be talking about this in quite a wide context, but focusing on someone called Louis Claude de Saint Martin. And he was a very influential figure and influenced by Jacob Boehme, who was very influenced in turn by Kabbalah in the end. But we're going to talk about how this movement started and this intelligentsia of this particular period and how it was steered and how Louis de Saint Claude Martin actually got free of it all. And it was over something incredibly simple, because in a way, what this was all about was simplicity in itself, in that it was about the relationship between oneself and the Creator and through Jesus Christ, which was actually the belief system that many of these people were brought up into. And where it clashed and started to go off the rails was when they started getting into the esotericism of the Kabbalah. So that's going to be the sort of basis of what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're talking about post-Reformation here. We had alchemy, philosophy. We had the incoming age of reason, the herding of the intelligentsia. And they didn't know much about this new system which had been created in the Languedoc, which was purported to have come from something much older. We're going to give you a little background on that tonight, but do have a look at a show called The Con Men of Kabbalah, several articles on that, and also Occult That Rules the World, where we talked about the occult and esoteric theurgical branches of Freemasonry, which actually were very influential in the revolutions, both the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, through certain lodges, which are known as Illuminati lodges, which spread from Britain, France, and to the Orient. So we're going to be covering all that, and we're going to give you, hopefully, a bigger picture. So I'm going to go back now to a show we did called The Mysterious Force, the force they fear, because Freemasonry was allegedly set up in 43 AD to counter the power of the early Christians. And that is really what these people we're going to be talking about tonight were doing in the first instance. So the purpose of Freemasonry was to counter the power of the early Christianity. And when we look at the results of that, we can see very clearly that they are two opposing systems, even though, of course, we are told that the Scottish Rite and the York Rite, which is under the Scottish Rite, are mainly Christian-based organizations. And they also say they are multi-faith organizations. Nothing really could be further from the truth. Remember also about this, the main point is that divine providence is always straight from the source. So this is where a lot of the people who got into this alchemical magic in the 1700s really started to go wrong. But I'm going to give you something to start with, and it's from the Regius Manuscript. And the Regius Manuscript is actually the oldest known English Masonic document, dating from 1390, but referring to the time of King Athelstan around 925 to 939 AD, which was when Athelstan reigned in Britain. And it says in this document that the Freemasonry, which became the Scottish Rite, was actually already in Britain in the 900s. So this goes directly against what we're told, that the Freemasonry came into London around 1705. Then we got the Grand Lodge, which incorporated itself with the Freemasonry of 1717. They used that date. That's on the Grand Lodge in Great Queen Street in London. So let's see what it said in the Regius manuscript dating from 1390. Okay, so we're going to look at this document and the follow-up document to it, which is in this book called Macbean's History of Freemasonry. So the Regius manuscript said that Freemasonry was already in Britain in 925 AD, and it carries on in Macbean's Freemasonry. On this manner, through good wit of geometry, began the first craft of masonry. The clerk Euclid, on this wise, it found this craft of geometry in Egypt land, in divers lands on every side. It was taught far and wide. Many years afterwards, I understand, ere that the craft came into this land. This craft came into England, as I say, in time of good King Athelstan's day. So the original Freemasonry of Britain was actually brought in around the 800s. And that's according to Scandinavian sources. So what seems to have happened is these Scandinavian rituals, which became part of this craft, which was brought into Britain through Scandinavia, was actually corrupted by the Cabalists of the 12th, 13th century in the Languedoc. So by the time of the Templars in the 12th century, and of course the 1500s, the Cabala of the Languedoc, according to Masonic history, and the lodges of Egypt and the Grand Orient of France and Asia were already embedded, shall we say, well embedded. And the Cabalistic Freemasonry became the Scottish Rite. The York Rite was, of course, under the Scottish Rite. It is the Scottish Rite which actually runs everything, including the Grand Orient Lodge of France and all the Illuminati lodges underneath it, so-called Illuminati lodges, which were attended by the great and the good of society in Europe. And to this day, those empty castles we see across Germany, Austria, and France are still used by these Masonic organizations who actually hire them for their ceremonies, meetings, and their initiations. So we're talking about something that is a very elite concept here. And what they wanted to do was hoover up all the best thinkers of the times into, it seems, a very large steering mechanism. So Occult That Rules the World is one of the shows which we will be referring to. The Elected Priesthood of the Universe, also known as the Ellis Cohen. They are very much what we're going to be talking about this evening through the people we're going to get into who were very influential within this European intelligentsia. So we have another one called the Rosicrucian Mystery, which is in inverted commas, and we have shows on Kabbalah, Con Men of Kabbalah. Just look that up at windowsontheworld.net for a great potted history, because of course these subjects are full of waffle. And for the past 3 days, I've been going through a lot of these documents, and they really do like to waffle on. And you get to the end of these books and you're still none the wiser half the time. They could have got it into the preface of the book, what they're actually saying, over 400 and 500 pages. So there was a lot of alliteration and expanding on theories. And also, of course, with the Freemasonic theurgical organizations, we get this obsession with ritual, which is actually quite amusing. The neurosis, which came from the Talmud later into the Kabbalah, is very evident in the neurosis and ritual of occult Freemasonry. And that is what we are going to be getting through tonight. In other words, the people who went through this maybe came out the other side and realized that they'd had their time wasted and their energy harvested. And what Louis de St. Claude Martin actually found out was that he couldn't serve two masters. And that's what's so interesting about this. So in the end, he actually turned away from the thing that he really loved, that he'd put a good part of his life into, which was occult Freemasonry. So Louis Claude de St. Martin, he found this out under the banner of the unknown philosopher. He published many works, and he was extremely influenced by Jacob Boehme. So I think we should give Jacob Boehme a little mention before we get on, because I've got some notes here. He started out as a cobbler. He lived from 1575 to 1624. And he had some ideas which were actually really simplistic. But of course, like all of these people, they were influenced by the Kabbalah and esoteric mysticism. So they tended to flesh things out, which are actually very simple. But Boehme, or Boehme, it's Bohme, if you want to look him up, Jacob Boehme, he believed that God had actually created the dark, Christ brought the light, and the material world was where all of this came together, which is a working model. You could say that is a concept, a working concept of how things appear to be. So there was a mechanical side to these people. They were very good at engineering. A lot of them were very precise in architecture and mathematics, and this all came together into mysticism. So Louis Claude de Saint Martin had been very influenced by Boehme, and he was also inspired by Martinez de Pasquale, who had actually started the Order of the Elis Cohen, the elected priesthood of the universe. No, nobody elected them. And this later went into what is known as Martinism. And let's now get a definition of what Martinism is, because we've covered it before, but it can be very confusing because there's several figures here. There's Martinez de Pasquale, and of course, there is Louis Claude de Saint Martin, and they operated in different times. So according to popular belief, Martinism is a form of Christian mysticism and esoteric Christianity concerned with the fall of the first man, his materialistic state of being, deprived of his own divine source, and the process of his return called reintegration. This is the whole cover story for Freemasonry. In other words, you've been separated from your divinity, and through a series of initiations, you will get back to it. Of course, no one ever does, because you had it in the first place. They are relating this here to the Cabalistic Adam Kadmon, the divine man, the complete man, which everyone was taught was out of their reach because they had to have an intermediary to get back to it, which is, of course, the trick. That's the trick with the Catholic Church. It's the trick with Freemasonry. And it's the trick with all of this occult theocracy and what became alchemy with people like Paracelsus, the great physician. So when we look at this, we're talking about people who were incredibly well educated, but in a way which was above normal education. So a lot of the esoteric waffling that they got into was due to their own intellect, which makes it quite amusing. So in other words, they were trying to describe something very simple, and a lot of them had actually had experiences. Jacob Boehme had experiences, for instance, mystical experiences that he never wrote about for 12 years when he was a cobbler. And then he started writing it down. And his view was of reintegration, that these divine experiences bring reintegration with the divinity. And of course, what we're really talking about is something quite simple. We're talking about God's providence. And to stay in God's providence, we have to be involved in right action at the right time and keep ourselves in a pure state and a receptive state. It's all quite simple. So yes, they talked about the reintegration of being as a mystical tradition. It was first transmitted through a Masonic high degree system. This is the Elis Cohen into Martinism, established around 1740 in France by, as we said, Martinez de Pasquale, and later propagated in different forms by his two students, Louis Claude de Saint Martin and Jean-Baptiste Villemoz. The term Martinism applies to both this particular doctrine and the teachings of the reorganized Martinist order founded in 1886 by Augustin Chaboseau and Gerard Oncasse, also known as Papus. So that's where it gets confusing, because there's like two branches of this. There's the earlier branch and the later branch. It says in the Dictionary of Freemasonry, which I've been referring to, which is McBean's, this confusing Disambiguation has been a problem since the late 18th century, where the term Martinism was already used interchangeably between the teachings of Louis Claude de Saint Martin and Martinez de Pasquale, and the works of the first being attributed to the latter. Now, in a way, one could say this was deliberate, because when we look at the later Martinist works, they are an allegorical mixture of ritual from all these different writers, and they all had their different ways of working, tying themselves up in knots with these rituals. And I'm going to read some of those out so you can see how absurd and absolutely mind-boggling they are. The amount of attention to detail and what one had to do to put oneself into this was really just a form of mind control. We could say that in modern parlance. So Martinism, as we know it today, can be divided apparently into three forms through which it has been chronologically transmitted. The theurgic tradition of Martinez de Pasquale is called Martinism. The Masonic Templarism of Jean-Baptiste Villemoz is called Villemozism. And the Christian theosophy of Louis Claude de Saint Martin is known as Christian theosophy. So there's those three different branches. And I think this is the problem that Louis Claude de Saint Martin had with it in the end. He realized that he was batting for the wrong team, but he was so defending of the Brotherhood and so supporting of them that he didn't really want to come out and say it. And also a very interesting thing about Louis Claude de Saint Martin being a Christian, he was never properly accepted by the Martinists. He was never really accepted by the Ellis Cohen or the Martinists. So even after he'd been initiated and his writings were being circulated, he was known as the unknown philosopher, but people knew who he was. But his work was definitely not accepted in the high Freemasonic circles, which is interesting. So this heritage was reorganized into the Order of the Martiniste in 1886 by Augustin Chaboseau and Géraudon Cosse, as we said, also known as Papus. And interestingly, Martinism was revived again in 1946 by Robert Amberlain. And I will be referring to Robert Amberlain's book on Martinism, which gives a lot of Louis Claude de Saint Martin's theurgical practices. It's got a lot of information in there. So simple concepts, really, but wrapped in complexities. Infiltration of revolutions. The French Revolution was heavily steered by Martinists and the Illuminati lodges of the Grand Orient Freemasonry in France. That is, of course, quite well known. But when we look at these revolutionary movements and how people were recruited, then one looks at these alternative versions of the French Revolution. In other words, the real versus its stated goals, the cover story and the real story makes a lot of sense. If you look at a book called Synarchy, which is all about this takeover through these groups, which had infiltrated the whole of France, Asia, and the continents by this time. So the Freemasonic Cabalism of the 1700s spread after Rosicrucianism, which was meant to be a recruiting drive for the great and the good. And of course, we've covered that. We've covered their Fama Fraternitatis and the following documents, the Confessio, and the third document, which is the Alchemical Wedding, an allegorical trip through different tests that people who are guests in a house have to make. It's a little more complicated than that, as you can imagine, but it was put out by Johannes Valentin. And these people were quite persecuted by the Jesuits, which is interesting. So the Rose Cross was a kind of recruiting ground for the great and the good of Europe. It really did absorb the European monarchies and the high class and well-educated people of Europe, because they all wanted to be part of this new movement, which was meant to be a pure return to a more divine approach to the incoming rationalism and materialism, which was being enforced through the Age of Reason. So Yes, Jacob Boehme actually was influenced by Robert Flood, who was influenced again by Kabbalah. And Robert Flood had used direct contact with Jesus initially. In other words, he just used the Holy Spirit, but like all the Kabbalists, he got lost in what's called the verbum or the Metatron Christ Messiah, bringing Christ into the Kabbalah. So stating that Christ and Metatron are the same entity. So this is going into the Apocrypha and the Book of Enoch and the Zohar, which was written by Moses de Leon in the 13th century, but attributed to Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai. And I think it's quite interesting to read this out because this is a book by Bernard Pick, the Kabbalah, and its influence on Judaism and Christianity, published in 1913. And it's quite interesting what he says about the Zohar, because the Zohar is a huge volume which was the main work referred to by the Kabbalists. And the Zohar contains passages which Moses de Leon translated into Aramaic from his works. One was called the Sefer HaRimon, and as the Jewish author Jelinek has demonstrated in his Moses de Leon and Sein Versailles zum Zohar, which was published in Leipzig in 1851, page 21 to 26, if you want to know. He says, these are some of the reasons why the Zohar is now regarded as a pseudograph of the 13th century, and that Moses de Leon should have palmed the Zohar upon Simeon ben Yochai was nothing remarkable, since this rabbi is regarded by tradition as the embodiment of mysticism. So what he did was he masqueraded as Simon ben Yochai, this Moses de Leon in the 12th century, 1300s, in Languedoc in France. That's where all of this stuff happened. There were also Kabbalists in modern day Palestine. Nathan of Gaza was one of them. We've talked about a lot of these people. They were very influential in Britain too, very influential with certain rabbis. And Rabbi Jacob Emden was convinced, for instance, that Samuel Falk, the Baal Shem Tov of London, was a Sabbatean. So we now get into the Sabbatean Frankist connection, which is full infiltration of Christian esotericism by crypto representation. In other words, that we have the Don May of Turkey masquerading as Muslims, and then we had the later infiltration of the Catholic Church into Ireland, and we've done many shows on that. But it says that we learned that when Moses de Leon's wife asked him why he published the production of his own intellect under another man's name, Moses de Leon replied that if he were to publish it under his own name, nobody would buy it. Whereas under the name of Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai, it yielded him a large revenue. So it's all about the money at the end of the day. So that's a little bit about the Kabbalah, which doesn't usually get mentioned. So yes, we've been talking about Robert Flood, and Flood achieved a certain notoriety in his own time for his early support of the Rosicrucian manifestos, which were derided by certain elements in the Catholic Church. But the interesting thing about the Rosicrucians is they purported to be more of a Reformation and Protestant movement. The documents were actually printed in Germany, and they were distributed from a PO box, and this all added to the mystery. So yes, in his treatise, The Apologia of 1616, Robert Flood expanded into another Tractatus Apologeticus in 1618, which came to be called the Rosicrucian Manifestos. And these actually consisted of the Farmer, which appeared in 1614, followed by the Confessio in 1615. So we have him implicated in the authorship of these documents, but he certainly wrote very favorably about them. Of course, we do not know who wrote them. They are anonymous, but the Alchemical Wedding is attributed to Johann Valentin. So they were published anonymously in Cassel. The authors never revealed themselves, but they called for supporters to join the Rosicrucian movement and claimed to have been in existence for centuries. Well, they claimed to have been reincorporated 140 years after the death of Father R.C. Christian Rosenkreutz, who actually never really existed. And this is a very interesting story, how people are hooked in, because the great and the good all wanted that tap on the shoulder to be invited into the Brotherhood of the Rosicrucians, because it was meant to be the most high functioning order of intellectuals in Europe at the time. So most of a radical reformist character is how it is described, as well as adherence to antique philosophy and magic. Again, we have the Kabbalah coming in, and also we have people like Paracelsus, the brilliant Paracelsus, who actually discovered how the human circulation works. His books are allegorical, they are alchemical, and they are really hard to understand. They're probably encoded. I've got the works of Paracelsus, and it's interesting, but not that revealing. So that is definitely typical of what these people really got into: navel gazing and waffling, really, as they call it, allegory. So we also had Cornelius Agrippa, who was a 16th century sage, and he was really part of this magical, theurgical thought group which had taken over the great and the good of Europe. And the manifestos seem to have been written to counteract the reconversionary activities of the Jesuit order in Europe, according to conventional history, said to be supporters of a legendary figure of the 14th century, Christian Rosenkreutz. I think he was born in 1357 or something. Or the whole thing is actually, it gets very contradictory by the time we get to the alchemical wedding. We start to get different versions of the story creeping in. Originally, Father RC had gone to Morocco, to Fez. He'd gone to Damkar in Damascus. He got this secret Book of M, which he translated into Latin and gave to the great and the good. And it's very entertaining, but it's storytelling, and it hooked a lot of people in. So a number of rights and degrees arose in France, whose lodges directed the French Revolution. And those do include the Martinists and the Ellis Cohen. So Martinism is known to have been a player in the revolution. So I'm going to go back to McBean's Freemasonic history here. All these rites laid claims to origins of which it would have been difficult to produce documentary proofs, even when they were not pure legendary, traditional, fanciful, or perhaps even self-contradictory. So there you go. Even they say it. As in Kabbalah, fake mystery, and endless ritual, and a hierarchy of initiation, jumping through endless hoops, basically going nowhere, a huge energy harvest for the rest of your life when the Holy Spirit has been there from day one. So that is what the more intelligent people found out. And again, from McBean's history, our present day Freemasonry grew forth in Germany, France, Scotland, and England in the 1600s. The order in its original form was established in 1705 by the Grand Assembly, or the Grand Lodge at York. The system was quickly adopted and became predominant in continental Europe. The ancient and primitive rite of Memphis continued the hermetic and spiritual teachings of the ancient Egyptians. So here we have the Egyptian lodges, which spread through Europe too. So this is why we have this mishmash of different symbology. If we look at Freemasonry, we have symbology which encompasses the Egyptians, it encompasses the Kabbalists, and it tries to encompass elements of esoteric Christianity, or what they later called Christian mysticism. It is known to practice 95 degrees, each with their own respective secrets and ceremonies. That's the Egyptian rite, not the Scottish rite, which of course has 33. I think the York rite has 12 or 13. So an Egyptian named Ormus in AD 46 is alleged to have founded, with the help of the Essenes, a school for the unification of the Egyptian mysteries with the new law. So we've done shows on ancient Egypt and its ritual, its neurosis, and its materialistic interpretation of death. In other words, you're going to take your furniture with you to the next life. So it was really also an order of chivalry. The Knights of Palestine were founded in AD 118 and transferred to Scotland in 1150, where a Grand Lodge was founded in Edinburgh with the object of reviving the wisdom of Ormus. This is quite interesting because the Orm means serpent or gold. And that's a Scandinavian name and a Scandinavian word. Modern Masonry is alleged to be derived from it. So that's interesting. So we can't really believe a word that we're told by the cover story of Freemasonry, because they are the epitome of the real versus the statist goals. Because, of course, they're not a secret society. They are a society with secrets. So then we get into Templar Freemasonry in the 1700s. If you go into the City of London, you'll see in the churches that the Templar Freemasonry, of course, you've got the Templar Church in London as well. And you can see that this Templar Freemasonry really took hold and was again completely Cabalistic by the 1700s. And by the time we get into the 18th century, the steering mechanism was very much in place. We also have the Philadelphies. We were founded at Narbonne in the Languedoc on the 27th of December, 1779. Now, there's a whole list of these different lodges and these different groups within Freemasonry. There are actually hundreds of them, but I found McBean's history of Freemasonry incredibly useful because it's a bit of a potted history. So along with many others in the Hall of Freemasonry Fame, we find the influence exercised over some of the people that we've been talking about: Robert Flood, Jacob Boehme, the inspiration of Louis Claude de Saint Martin, and his guide in Masonry, of course, was Martinez de Pasquale, the great adept in transcendent Masonry. So if we go to the history of Freemasonry, we find that Louis Claude de Saint Martin is mentioned along with Martinez de Pasquale as very influential within Masonry, which is interesting because, as we've said in the first part of the show, Louis Claude de Saint Martin was not accepted into the hierarchy of Freemasonry, I think most probably because of his Christian leanings. Therefore, he wasn't part of this new age religion which was coming in. So the Martinist order came out of the Ellis Cohen. Its name is derived from that of Louis Claude de Saint Martin, and Martinez de Pasquale and Jacob Boehme were the influence on Martinism, later Martinism. The first Martinism, of course, Louis Claude de Saint Martin was influenced by Martinez de Pasquale, who was believed to have been a Sephardic Jew from Spain. So St. Martin wrote many books under the name of the unknown philosopher. He wanted to stay anonymous, but of course people knew who he was. And his books were really concerning human nature and our relationship to the universe. He never really got into truly expansive thinking, but he was very intellectual. And that's, I think, why he in the end stepped out of Freemasonry, because he found it too restricting, and he realized that the simplicity of the early Christianity was being completely clouded and ruined by this infiltration. So through him, the traditional Martinist order is linked to a tradition with roots going back to what they call the primordial tradition, at a time when humanity, they say, was privileged to unite itself freely with the divine without any intermediary. You see, this is where this Kabbalistic idea of the Adam Kadmon comes in, and the fall of man trying to get back to his original divine nature. Well, that is possible. This is what we talk about being in God's providence, if you do everything for the right reason. And people still, and to this day, are very confused about this, because most people do things for selfish reasons. They don't think outside themselves. And of course, that's a great way to control people, because people who are selfish and egotistical are very easy to control. So that's a program. And I think the interesting thing about these people is they did at least break out of that program, because it was all coming in, of course, with the Age of Reason, where Thomas Paine and the Age of Reason, and this kind of takeover of especially the Protestant Reformation movement. And I think it seems to me that what was happening was that they needed to control these so-called radicals, these free thinkers, who were really bringing Christianity into a new era through the Reformation. And of course, the Reformation had been controlled by this point. And then, of course, we get to the modern day. And what do we have out of Kabbalah? The logical conclusion after 1948 is Christian Zionism, one of the biggest deceptions in modern history. So these organizations, of course, were all about ritual. So the Ellis Cohen, the Order of Knight Masons Elect Priest of the Universe, the self-elected priesthood of the universe, was a theurgical organization founded by Martinez de Pasquale. It appeared in France in the second half of the 18th century, but had been formed before. And the first branch of Martinist tradition was known as Martinism. The Ellis Cohens translates as elect priests, of course, and was intended as an elite, esoteric Christian order for Masonic associates of the founder, Martinez de Pasquale, who was himself a Sephardic Jew from Spain. And Martinez de Pasquale was born, wait for it, Jacques de Livron Joachim de la Tour de la Casa Martinez de Pasquale. So good they named him twice. 1727, he was born in Grenoble in France, and there are scant biographical details attributed to him. Now, this is interesting because we find that with a lot of these people, they bury their backstory. So the people who got into these organizations openly, we know about them. But the people who formed them in the first place, like Martinez de Pasquale, we know very little about. And this again goes into the Rosicrucians with their mystical, mythical, and made-up Father RC. It says in the library that I've been looking at, which is McBean's, it says, like many of the esoteric masters of the Enlightenment era, he bore several different titles, which no doubt perpetuated the confusion around his identity and contributed to his character as something of an enigma. There you go. So what was the Rose Cross before the Ellis Cohen? The Rose Cross described itself as a mystery wrapped in an enigma. So all this, of course, is to tease people in who may be very intelligent, but are in fact quite easily steered. So yes, it is believed that Martinez de Pasquale was a Jew who converted to Catholicism. So he could have been part of the infiltration group, which later became the Sabbateans, and definitely through the Kabbalah, which links them all together. So Sabbatean Frankism, so that's Sabbatai Zvi and later Jacob Frank, they were linked through Kabbalah. And nothing ever good came out of these people. Only bad things came from Sabbatai Zvi, who proclaimed himself the Messiah in 1666, ended up as a doorman for the Sultan because the Sultan said, if you don't stop spreading this nonsense, we're going to execute you. But you can actually convert to Islam. So Sabbatai Zvi, he actually converted to Islam. Jacob Frank was a psychopathic nutcase who wrote about the murders that he committed, the people that he'd stitched up who got killed because they were in the wrong place when it was believed that he was going to be there. Absolute psychopath. His daughter was a psychopath. She claimed herself to be the Messiah. Her name was Ava Frank. A lot of this took place in what is now modern day Ukraine and Poland. That's where Jacob Frank was. And this is going into the 1800s, you see. Now, this is the interesting thing because we see the whole thing coming together through Sabbatean Frankism. The infiltration was then complete. The Christian organized church, the Catholic Church, the Universal Church, and the Reformation Protestantism had been infiltrated. And I think this is possibly what Louis Claude de Saint Martin found out, even though he never actually said it, because of course he would have had his throat cut. So he had to stay on good terms with the people he'd been initiated into the Brotherhood. So once he became known, this is Pasquale, in Masonic circles around the 1750s, there is far more information to draw upon, most notably his establishment of the Ellis Cohen in 1767. The focus of the order was on establishing an invisible church, independent of any earthly structure, to find the path that leads to the hidden knowledge of nature in anticipation of the coming destruction of the material church. What do we see now? the destruction of the material church. In other words, the physical churches are being destroyed, not brick by brick, even though a lot of them are being burnt down and destroyed. They have been infiltrated by agents of change who have diluted the original Christianity into a mishmash of New Age garbage, and they have no spiritual power. Therefore, organized Christianity has been destroyed, but the force they fear is still there, which is why people like Louis Claude de Saint Martin, I think, are quite interesting, because they got back to this original state, which is, of course, there for everybody. One doesn't have to jump through the hoops of the priesthood or the assumed priesthood and the hierarchies of the Illuminati lodges or any other lodge which is in existence today. And of course, with the advent of the global to local communitarianism, Freemasonry has kind of fulfilled its purpose. So it says, simplified, they followed other esoteric or Rosicrucian orders, that's the Ellis Cohen, that offered a system that would lead to direct knowledge of God to obtain the primordial unity lost since the fall of Adam. In other words, the Cabalistic Adam Kadmon was the unification of everything again. And this does have some basis in the Gnostic belief and the Sophia and the fall of Sophia, which was the divine energy where God had placed Sophia in the gatekeeping role of divinity, and Sophia had been somehow cast down and was trying to get out. It's very similar to what was going on in Languedoc. So once we get to the later Cathars, which came from catharsis, of course, because they enjoyed to get hugely excited and go into reverie. They were a direct threat, though, to the Universal Church. And of course, they were killed in the Languedoc with the Albigensian Crusade, which was to wipe out heresy, which was in 1178, which then, of course, carried on with what they called Christian heresy. The people who had written the Bible in English, see our film, The Heretics of London, the Smithfield Martyrs, very deep dive on all that. But it does appear that Protestantism, the Reformation movement of the 1500s, had been well and truly captured into these Kabbalistic orders of Freemasonry, and later, of course, into international Zionism. So the order was worked as a high-level degree of Freemasonry based on the Blue Lodges of Freemasonry. Now, the Ellis Cohen do not have anything like as many grades, rituals as the Scottish Rite, and they have different versions of the Ellis Cohen as well. But I think it's about 12 that they have at the most, and they have similar names. They do have, I think, a Rose Cross degree, and they have a Kadosh degree, which is similar to the Scottish Rite, which is, of course, is entirely Kabbalistic. So the aim was to enlist the help and support of people like John Dee and Edward Kelly. Now, John Dee wrote Conversations with Angels. He was an astrologer, very clever, but again, I think an enthusiastic seeker of the truth who kind of got hoodwinked into this dead end, if you like. That's the way I see it, because there's too much stuff written about this where it just goes on and waffles. It's a bit like listening to a word salad when you can just go directly to the source. And that, I think, was the main point that I was thinking about when putting this show together. So after his death in 1774, Pasquale's doctrine was continued by his most devoted followers, Jean-Baptiste Villemos and Louis Claude de Saint Martin. Pasquale's philosophy and rituals were to influence more than a handful of other esoteric or para-Masonic orders, including the Order of the Martinists, established by Gerard Oncos, we talked about him, also known as Papus, and Augustin Chaboseau in 1884. The Order Martiniste de Ellis Cohen, established in 1946, is the second most recent incarnation of the Martinists. There was another Martinist, Ellis Cohen, organization incorporated in 2002 from Scandinavia, and they're the most recent incarnation of the Order of Rose Cross. And I was told about them by a journalist in Sweden about 10 years ago. And he said, look into these. They've reformed this organization. And that's when I started looking back into this and where it all started to come together. So I hope this is making some sense to you. So I think the word allegorical accurately describes the thousands of manuscripts and books that were put out by writers on these subjects. So we're going to now go to the closing paragraphs of Robert Amberlane's 1946 Revival of Martinism. And that's quite an interesting volume. You can download that off the internet. This really does indicate the romanticism and the fantasy side. And also we see that it ties in with the Knights Templar and the King Arthur legend, because of course the Templars adopted Freemasonry. Well, it's known as Templar Freemasonry, which is entirely, again, Cabalistic. So let's see how Robert Amberlane's 1946 Martinism book ends. Once more, the white cohort of the Knights of the Table Round will assemble at summer solstices to the sound of horns disturbing the secular vaults of the Celtic forests in some surreal glade of Brociolande. Arthur and Merlin, Lancelot and Galahad, Gavin, Percival and Tristan, evanescent phantoms saluting the ascent to the altar of the knight priest bearer of the Holy Grail with a great wave of their sword, and in the bosom of the new celestial Jerusalem, blazing across the regenerated Luciferian emerald, the blood of the Redeemer can finally illuminate men, the radiant heart of the world, through the infinity of his supreme wisdom and his divine love. So here we have the whole expansion of mythology and keeping ourselves away from the central idea of Christianity through mystery and waiting for the mythical Arthur to return and for New Jerusalem to be born. Well, the New Jerusalem is here. It is the people who have actually, to use their word in the correct sense, illuminated their minds, not filled their minds with rituals and neurosis and garbage, which came out of the law, which had come out of ancient Egypt into what is, in modern terms, since the 15th century, called Judaism, into what these people who called themselves Hebrews, who were generally under this banner. Of course, Hebrew was a language and it was based on Aramaic, and it was later changed back to Aramaic. So when we're talking about these things and talking about history, we have to know and delineate exactly what we're talking about. This is one of the main problems and one of the big bricks that Freemasonry has actually thrown into people's path. So here we see this idea of the New Jerusalem. William Blake, of course, was massively inspired by this Cabalistic doctrine in his Jerusalem, which apparently took him about 2 years to write. Well, the first verse is very good. The other two you can throw away, in my opinion. So they all loved elucidating. And what I think is important about this is to get to the central issue. And we're talking here about control systems. So the mixing of mythology with changing texts to suit oneself, which is the Zohar, of course, and Christianity came about through this esoteric Christianity of Kabbalah channeled into alchemy, theosophy, of course, Freemasonry, Madame Blavatsky, into the New Age through Alice Bailey. Then, of course, we get the Lucis Trust. I mean, I'm giving you a potted history here because we haven't got that much time, but this led into, of course, the Illuminati lodges of France, the Scottish Rite, the Egyptian lodges, the Ellis Cohen, and, of course, the Martinists. So I'm going to read you now something from the introduction of Robert Amberlane's book on Martinism, 1946, and it's all about Louis Claude de Saint Martin, the unknown superiors of Louis Claude de Saint Martin. Louis Claude was born in Amboise, in the Touraine, On the 18th of January 1743, he studied law and became a barrister. And at some point, he decided law was not for him. He joined the army. In the army, he was garrisoned at Bordeaux, and he made the acquaintance of another officer, a Mr. or Monsieur de Granville, who was affiliated with the Order of the Elders Cohen. The order had just been founded in 1767 by Martinez de Pasquale. St. Martin was initiated into the Cohens in 1768. St. Martin only had a little success among the Elders Cohen. As we've said earlier, he was rejected by them mainly, which I think would have been puzzling to a young man who thought that he was going into real illumination. And of course, Pasquale died. Well, I don't think we've actually got to that bit yet, but it's in our show, Occult That Rules the World. Pasquale, question mark, Pasquale died in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. He was only 47 years old. So Louis Claude was hugely enthused about the order, but of course never truly accepted. And today, though, Louis Claude de Saint Martin is absolutely revered in the history of Freemasonry. He made the acquaintance of Rodolphe de Salzmann, a translator and commentator on the mystical German philosopher Jacob Boehme, who we've mentioned. Saint Martin held Boehme in the highest reverence. In fact, Boehme was his main inspiration. In the grounds and developments which Boehme opens up may be found the keys of every universe and the principle of every key. So St. Martin absolutely idolized Jacob Boehme. Now, I've actually read quite a lot of Boehme stuff. To me, it's very convoluted, and his central points, I think, were very good, very simple. But it just gets expanded and expanded upon. But Boehme was born in 1575 in Saxony, Germany. Of course, this was originally the true heart of Christian Europe. And of course, the Rosicrucians spread from Germany, and we had these Illuminati lodges of France, Scotland, and the Orient, and the mysterious attachment of the ritual nonsense of the Egyptians. So, yes, he was a German philosophical mystic. This is the Boehme's write-up, who had profound influence on much later intellectual movements, such as idealism and, of course, romanticism. So another influential organization at this time came out of what are known as the Brothers of the East. Again, a huge influence on Louis Claude de Saint Martin. It was actually founded in Constantinople, modern day Turkey, Istanbul, in 1090 under the patronage of Emperor Alexis Comnenus. It was a secret, here we go, mystic fraternity, grouped together the adepts of the Rosicrucians and the evangelical Protestant type of reformers. This order was that of the unknown philosophers. So this is what Louis Claude actually wrote under, the banner of the unknown philosopher. And his group were actually known as the unknown philosophers. So this was quite a large group which he was part of. And this is what they called the Gnosis, which came out of the reformist movement. So yes, this is the infiltration of Protestantism, which we've covered. And from 1646 in France, the public authorities has been led to investigate a mysterious society called the Brotherhood of the Holy Sacrament. It was allegedly a secret Catholic society and a subsidiary of the Holy League, which saw its members in the Brothers of the East and part of the Reformation. So we can see the steering was going on for a long time. It is to this order that Louis Claude de Saint Martin was admitted a century and a half after its foundation in 1643. So he got into the group of the unknown philosophers, published under this title also. And St. Martin wanted to lead back the minds of the people to his age. At the time, he wanted to take them back to Christianity as understood by himself. But he judged that the mind of the age was in no mood to tolerate an explicit defense of Christianity. Here we have the two things. Here we have the things that are conflicting within his mind, because what happened was that he could not openly express the divinity of Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, because these people were into this form of theurgical magic. So in a way, he had his hands tied and he went all over the place. The infiltration of the church and the Sabbateans, we've covered that. The Kabbalists, the Christianity through the lens of Kabbalah. Of course, there's no such thing. They are diametric opposites. One is through ritual and process. The other is through God's divine presence. And this is what we've been talking about in the Perfected Mindfield series, divine providence. So what happened was that Louis Claude de Saint Martin was writing for the rationalists and the materialists who had taken possession of the conversation and the expansion of thought at the time. And the literary world in France was by this time making fun of Christianity. So we can see that this infiltration had started. And it says the gospel indeed were unqualified. People were unqualified to hear its acceptable sounds. And he wrote for the thoughtful among them, whose pride of reason had not yet utterly shut up the understanding of the heart. So he was writing from his own inspiration, and he placed a veil over his doctrine, according to Freemasonic literature, referring, for example, to Christ only under the name of the active and intelligent cause. So he was part of this new age of reason, and he was having to handicap himself away from inspiration and the Holy Spirit. So also, Louis Claude de Saint Martin had a lot to say about black magic. He said it was the criminal occupation of several peoples. It is even represented in astrology because all things are interlinked, and that man will always find false actions ready to respond to his false thoughts so as to achieve an ascendancy over him after appearing to favor and serve him. Quite an insightful way of looking at it, and very true. He said the bulk of humanity is divided practically into two sections, one of which is continually in astral passivity or in a servile and baleful somnambulism, while the other is in astral activity, more unfortunate still, for after it has attained its terms, it relapses into the most severe and terrible of slaveries. So it sounds like he was trying to warn people here. But he said above these, there is a salvage of humanity, which has transcended the astral region and is directed by the pure spirit. So he's trying to bring the Holy Spirit in again, which is quite interesting. But he's doing it through the veil of Freemasonry. So, yes, he said that these are men who have entered truly into the lineal way. They have separated the metals within them, alchemy, and are united to the tested gold. So he decided that he couldn't serve two masters, and he was also quite influenced by Swedenborg. Now, Emanuel Swedenborg had really just had these direct experiences of the spirit world, and he wrote them down, and they're extremely complicated and very personal. To me, they don't really hit it. They don't hit the spot. And I think that what was interesting about St. Martin is that he found the same thing with it. And he went back to Jacob Boehme and his simplified version of divinity. So that's a really interesting point as well. And Swedenborg is alleged to have been influenced by Samuel Falk, the Baal Shem Tov of London, who was accused of Sabbateanism by Rabbi Jacob Emden in London in the 1700s. So this to me is very interesting because Swedenborg would have been very influenced by the Kabbalists. In fact, it is known that Swedenborg lived very close to where Samuel Falk lived. So he would have known Samuel Falk. Samuel Falk presented himself as a bit of a magician. It was alleged that he got all the way to Epping from Whitechapel in his horse and cart with only 3 wheels, and the 4th one was rolling behind him all the way to Epping Forest. So he's making up all these legends. It's very Rosicrucian, it's very Kabbalistic, and he was alleged to have had a menorah that never went out. Well, it probably never went out when anyone was there, you know. It's just the stuff that was written about him is almost comedic. In fact, he comes over as a bit of a con man. He's actually buried in the Jewish cemetery in Bethnal Green. If you want to go and visit his grave, could be interesting, couldn't it? So yes, so Swedenborg had died in London, and out of his institution, Swedenborg, came this Church of the New Jerusalem. Swedenborg prepared the way for what became known as spiritualism, which was massive in the Victorian times, the table tapping. This is, of course, how Madame Blavatsky got famous, banging on the table. Is anybody there? Give us a sign. You know, Madame Macarte from the later works of the Restoration comedies. It was kind of a big thing at the time. So this was going into that world of spiritism. Basically, we're getting into the world of demonic possession here, which does have some kind of links to the rituals of the Ellis Cohen, unfortunately. Yes, so let's see what we got. We got back to the book which I've been looking at, which is all about St. Martin, but I wouldn't recommend you read it. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. It's got a couple of interesting paragraphs in 472 pages. It said, no man of visions and illuminations has done more than he to commonize the world of spirits. He had affinities with Cabalistic tradition by his law of correspondence and his doctrine of the grand man. This is referring to Swedenborg. So Swedenborg was directly under the influence of the Kabbalists and these people in London at the time. And again, going back to Adam Kadmon, the primordial man, the mystical concept representing the initial divine form of humanity, the fall of man, and trying to get back there, basically. So yes, I don't really want to get into all that because we've been covering quite a lot of stuff here. So the Rose Cross and Martinism, they say their outward desire was to raise the veil on the other world, to catch a glimpse of the gates of celestial Jerusalem, which of course we can do without ritual. It says that fabulous city of beatitudes in an eternal dawn. One thing one could say about these people is they were imaginative and poetic. You can't take that away from them. But once you've read 1,000 pages of this stuff and not learned anything, you quickly realize that a lot of it is a waste of time. Well, I kind of learned a bit before that, but I had to go through it. When I was younger, I was reading this stuff thinking, I'm going to get some great knowledge from this. And of course you don't. That's part of the trap. That's part of the hamster wheel that they keep you on. So they also, the people who were in these Masonic groups at the time, practicing Kabbalists, the Ellis Cohen, and the Martinists, the later Martinists, they would practice the religion around them and use its egregors. And this is actually from the Freemasonic history we've been talking about, McBean's, practicing the religion around them and using its egregors, its groupthink. So this is another form of infiltration. So these orders were about infiltration. Louis Claude de Saint Martin was working on the ritual magic and the work of the Ellis Cohen. And I think that's where he realized that he was getting into demonology and maybe he would step back and get back into simplicity again. His letters show his attention to detail and sometimes bewildering descriptions of ritual and ceremony. I'm going to read these out because they are absolutely absurd. So this is written in Bordeaux on the 20th of May, 1771. We don't know who he's talking to here, but he says, "Dear Master, this is the first of the dispatches which we need to send to you. I have sent a packet of 6 pages by this courier to the address you have given me. 5 containing the great ceremony of the grand architects. The 6th work contains a prayer or invocation for the daily work. I will shortly send you the tracing board of the grade, completely drawn out. You will only have to add the stars or candles according to the instructions which you will find in the ceremony. I am also sending you the words necessary for the reception and ordination, all with the corresponding papers, which will be easy for you to find." So let's go into one of their rituals now. "You must fix the day yourself in the prescribed interval between the new moon and the full moon. That is to say, between the first of the moon's cycle up to the 13th or 14th of the month. That is nothing set. One must repeat the first conjuration 3 times consecutively on the same day of work, and then on the 2 following days, the 2 other conjurations. That will make 9 repetitions of the conjurations in the 3 days. For this, you will trace a single circle with the W and a star or candle, the other star in your hand, in order to read the work. You will sense the circle 3 times with the ingredients you have, starting in the west and moving towards the north. The circumference of this circle has a radius of 1.5 feet. For the invocation I sent you by the last courier, you must precisely follow all the instructions regarding it. That is to say, you must operate it every day without regard to the moon, always tracing your circle with the W, with the star or candle in the center, and one in your hand to allow you to read, but without incense. So, and then he goes on. Here is the ex-conjuration of the south for the equinoxes. One makes the same ex-conjuration for Beelzebub, Baram, and Leviathan. Now, this is the interesting thing, that they would do these banishing rituals for demons, which to me would actually bring them in by invoking their names. What could possibly go wrong? So it says, immediately after saying Satan, placing the name of each at the beginning of each ex-conjuration. When performing the 4 ex-conjurations, one shows the talisman to the angle of the south. And he wrote that on the 7th of July, 1771. It's quite funny, actually, if you go to this book about him, which I don't recommend. It's got these things written down, and they go on for about 50 pages of this nonsense that doesn't really even make sense when you read it out. So yes, I would recommend the Kabbalah and its influence on Christianity, Bernard Pick in 1913. I'm going to read out the introduction to that because it puts things into context. Although the Kabbalah belongs to the past, it nevertheless demands our attention on the account of the interest taken in it by men like Raymond Lully, the Doctor Illuminatus, as he was styled, who died in 1315, Jean Picus de Mirandola, 1463 to 1494, John Reuchlin, of course, Reuchlin's Kabbalah, 1455, 1522. Of course, then we have MacGregor Mathers of the Golden Dawn and his Kabbalah Unveiled. So he brought that into the New Age movement. Cornelius Henry Agrippa von Nettesheim, 1486 to 1535. John Baptiste von Helmont, 1577 to 1644, in case you want to look any of these up. And the English scholars who we've mentioned, Robert Flood, 1574 to 1637, and Henry Moore, 1614 to 1687. And of course, Theophrastus Paracelsus, 1493 to 1541, Jacob Boehm, 1575 to 1624, who was also known as Philosophus Teutonicus, in case you wanted to know. So Boehm was attached to the Rose Cross, the Martinists, and the Ellis Cohen through his influence on the European aristocracy and, of course, the monarchies. A lot of this happened in Germany and Austria. So I think we've gone through a lot of stuff there. And I will have a look at the comments after this. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope it's filling in a few gaps, because really what we're trying to say here is this obsession with ritual and religion and being pushed into these egregors, these thought groups, especially Freemasonry and the New Age, which came out of Freemasonry, of course. You're being duped away from your own ability to have your own connection to the divine. So that really is what this is all about. Now we get to Louis Claude de Saint Martin's resignation letter from the Ellis Cohen. So here it is. It was in 1790 that he resigned, by the way. It becomes every day more incompatible with my way of being and the simplicity of my operation. Tolerance of public authorities during the Reformation is really what he was up against, and the idea that the Christian movements which had been part of had been infiltrated. This, I believe, is why he stepped back. So we can say that Jean-Claude was actually a victim, in a way, of his own intellect. I actually have a lot more here. I was just thinking, I'm not going to get through all this. I'm going to have to save it for another show. So I'm going to take you a bit further into this, because there was a lot of other magical stuff I wanted to get into, but I think I'll put that in another show. I didn't realize how long this was actually going to be. I have so much information here on Freemasonry, because once you start doing this, it's very difficult to stop. And I've got a lot of the rituals and the beliefs of the Ellis Cohen, which I think we'll save for another show, because I've been going on an hour and 9 minutes already. So let's get to his resignation, and we then get into the conclusion of this show. I beg to present and have accepted the resignation of my position in the inner order, and would like to be removed from all the Masonic registers and lists upon which I've been inscribed since 1785. This is interesting, because I think he realized that having his name with a signature, making oaths to these organizations, was against what he truly believed in. And I believe that's why he wanted his name removed from all the Masonic registers. There's no other reason for that. He says, my business no longer permits me to follow this career. A very diplomatic way of putting that his faith had told him that he was going completely the wrong direction. He says, I will not weary with a detailed explanation of the reasons for my decision. He knows well that in removing my name from the registers, he is doing nothing wrong, since it means nothing. Very cleverly worded, this, and actually it's making a lot more sense to me as I'm reading it out now. That's what I like about these shows. It focuses things in a way when you're doing them live. He says, beside, he knows nothing, that my spirit was never truly inscribed here. In other words, his heart was never in Masonry, which is probably why the Freemasons never really took to him, because they knew he wasn't part of their cult. He says, so that all that really lies upon the page is a superficiality. He saw through it. And then he kind of tries to smooth things out a bit so that they don't attack him. He says, we shall always be, I hope, as Cohens, through initiation. We are Cohens, and if my demission creates a problem with that, then I will have to sacrifice my initiation, seeing that the Masonic regime becomes every day more inconsistent with my manner of being and the simplicity of my path. I shall respect the path of my dear brothers, no less even to the grave, and they can be sure that I will not disturb it in my lifetime. In other words, the secrets he may have learned along the way, he was letting go of them forever. So he was finally free of the order, and he did it in a diplomatic way. In other words, he avoided having his throat cut or being hung from somewhere. So he says, farewell, dear brother. Give my greetings to your family and to all the brethren, both spiritual and temporal. Ora pro nobis, which means pray for us. So that's actually a very insightful and clever letter, which St. Martin gave as his resignation to the master of his lodge. So his biographers do insist he quit everything for Masonry, and in the end, it was nothing more to him than a burden. Yet nevertheless, the Freemasonic writers say he was anxious to remain a Rocra, or of the Rose Cross, in soul and spirit, faithful to the brethren and holding them in his heart. So in a way, there's a kind of mutual agreement that allowed him to step back, because he didn't denounce the order. He didn't say anything about them. He was respectful in the way that he left, but he asked to be removed from the registers because he knew what the oath meant. So this, to me, is one of the most interesting stories in Freemasonry. It's not about someone who just left. It's about someone who saw through the veil and got back to divine inspiration and into God's providence. And he went around for the rest of his life giving talks to small, unincorporated groups. So he left the organized discipline and the ritual neurosis of Freemasonry and its control mechanisms, and he did the right thing. And in a way, that is a great lesson for the times. Joining groups, becoming part of fake movements. I've always said that one should be an individual who can act collectively. Small groups are always the way forward. And in the future, of course, with the shutting down of speech and the impositions of technocracy and globalism and what other people use different terminology for, but is in fact a control system, this is going to be very useful. Small unincorporated groups, so we can learn a lot from Louis Claude de Saint Martin and the way that he conducted himself. So that was really the point of this show. And I still have so much more stuff here. But yes, divine providence is always straight from the source. And that, I think, is the lesson that he learned and the lesson that we can learn from him. So we're not talking about a figure who is known outside of Freemasonry, which is why I did this show. Hope you enjoyed it. Do stay in touch through the website, info@windowsontheworld.net. And I'll be doing another show in a few days. If you have any information, please send it in. Interestingly, people I knew from quite a long time ago have now got back in touch with me about ways that they're moving forward. And this is a lifelong learning project. That's the whole point. That's why it's really useful to know this stuff and to know how systems of governance work. Because after all, the Ellis Cohens and the Martinists are a system of government, and they still do have influence. They have this remodeled version, which to me is a bit train spotter-ish. But underneath all that, these people are still into this theurgical magic. And the way to defend oneself against attacks from these groups is to have the Holy Spirit and to work within divine providence. And that is as simple as it gets. And that is what Louis Claude de Saint Martin was trying to say all along, because that's what he said in the first place. That's where his mentor Jacob Boehm actually came from. So hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to have a look at the comments and I hope you got something out of it. Thanks a lot.